art space, I guess, creative space in River West, which is pretty much directly west of here. This reading is not sponsored by the conference, so we haven't set up transportation, but I know there are a number of people who are interested in going, so maybe after Stacy's talk is finished, if you want to meet up at the front here and see about coordinating rides, etc., that would be a good idea.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so Stacy Alaimo is professor of English at the University of Texas at Arlington, where she's been since 1994. She received her master's degree just down the road in Madison and her PhD from the University of Illinois, so I'm very happy to welcome her back to Wisconsin and the beautiful Midwest. In 2011, she was honorary guest researcher in the Posthuman Hub in liquifying, and her work is truly interdisciplinary and spans the fields of environmental humanities, animal studies, posthumanism, science studies, new materialism, gender theory, cultural studies, and multicultural American literatures. From her very first book, Undomesticated Ground, Recasting Nature as Feminist Space, published by Cornell University Press in 2000, Stacy has challenged what she described in that work as feminist theory's flight from nature and the nature-culture dichotomy, instead showing how American women writers consistently imagine nature as a space of feminist possibility. The collection Material Feminisms, published by Indiana in 2008, which she co-edited with Susan Heckman, was widely read and an important contribution to the most current feminist theories, as is her essay in that volume, Transcorporeal Feminisms and the Ethical Space of Nature. Her award-winning book, Bodily Nature, Science, Environment, and the Material Self, published also by Indiana in 2010, further contributes to feminist new materialism by extending her concept of transcorporeality in order to argue for a conception of the body not as passive matter, but as interfacing with and interconnected with the larger environment. And she uses this theoretical conception to take on practical and pressing questions of environmental justice and environmental health. Like the best feminist theory, Stacy's work is always simultaneously concerned with theory, activism, and ethics. Her work is uniquely situated within the context of this conference, and I would note that many of the abstracts we received cited her, in that Stacy's is a feminism that has consistently sought to historicize, challenge, and refine the concept of the Anthropocene, only recently named as such. But at the same time, hers is also a feminism that argues for an altered relation to, an increased attention to, and concern for the non-human world. One that understands that it is not only our concept of nature, or the Anthropocene, that requires critical attention and reimagining, but our concept of feminism and how we understand and imagine the humans that comprise it, and their relationship to and responsibility towards the non-human world. Please join me in welcoming Stacy Alaimo.
Thank you so much. I was thrilled to see the topic of this conference and the extraordinarily rich articulation of questions in the call for papers. I really was. Not only because I've long been working on those sites where environmentalism and feminism intersect, but also because I think that scholars in feminist, queer, post-colonial, and critical race studies must continue to assert the value of those intellectual traditions. There is still the danger that they will be written out or written off as secondary or marginal to new theoretical questions in the fields. The guidebook, it seems, for legitimating or purifying a new theory or a new field is to begin with the injunction to set feminist theory off to the side. I've seen this happen several times in several areas. So thank you, C21 and Richard Grusin, Delia Hanna, Emily Clark, and Rebecca Sheldon for bringing feminist thought to the forefront of these theoretical debates of the Anthropocene. I'm really grateful for that, so thank you. And thank you to Annette Hess for all of her very careful arrangements. I don't think she's in the room, but thank you very much. fact that we're discussing Anthropocene feminism here and now makes me reflect on the ironic progression of theoretical moments. In the early 1990s, when I was writing my dissertation, immersed in feminist theory and cultural studies, the prevailing critical impulse was to avoid any mention of nature considered an unreachable, real, or a repository of essentialisms. Even as I embraced the aims of post-structuralist feminism to undermine and subvert social constructions of gender, race, and sexuality, I thought that engaging with, rather than fleeing from, conceptions of nature would be more fruitful than avoiding them. But approaching particular formations of gender and nature, or feminism and environmentalism, was often met with apprehension, if not outright alarm. Now the tide seems to have shifted, and a conference such as this seems like a perfectly acceptable academic endeavor. Who knew that this would happen? Look, everyone's in this room. Perfectly respectable, sort of. Except for that last film that we saw. There's that. So my work, along with that of other material feminists, and for me, quite notably, Myra Hurd, who's here, rethinks nature, corporeality, and materiality in ways that make it ludicrous to imagine the substance of the world as a repository, a static vault for retrograde cultural formulations, or the passive plastic resource for the exploits of culture. Material feminisms, precisely because they radically rethink the concepts of nature and the environment in ways that see them as agential, emergent, and intertwined with whatever it is we've been demarcating as exceptionally human or cultural, make it possible for feminists to engage with all that has been imagined as distinct from culture without reinstalling gender, race, or other essentialisms. But while material feminists emphasize the strange agencies of bodies, places, and substances, as well as the political and economic forces that enable or prevent us from knowing what these agencies entail, dwelling within the time and place of the Anthropocene means fundamentally emphasizing collective human agency. To imagine the human as altering the world poses these two terms as homogeneous masses with a chasm between them. A transcorporeal subject, however, moving through the Anthropocene, must understand herself as constituted by her environs. The material feminist subject is always the very stuff of intersecting systems of power, but these networks are neither primarily discursive nor readily discernible. To occupy this position, rather than to simply be what we have no choice not to be, can be a mode of politics. A mode of politics with a very feminist cast. To be, to move as, to think as the very stuff of the world is to inhabit not just permeability, but vulnerability as a mode of posthumanist dissolution. To occupy the Anthropocene from within, to dwell in a world of fearful transformations and unspeakable loss. And I hear the words here of Juliana Spar, gentle now, don't add to heartache. Fabulous poem. Posthumanist vulnerability is not for the faint of heart, however. It is more reassuring, not to mention more consumerist, to reinstall modes of knowing that distance and contain the threat of emergent and messy worlds. So in my talk today, I would like to critique representations of the Anthropocene that I find rather unhelpful, and then propose an alternative figuration of sorts, that of your shell on acid. And I have to apologize, I did have another part to my talk about queer desire, and then there was no time for queer desire, alas. What a terrible thing to lose here. And then I also have to note that I've been laughing today, and yesterday sort of laughing, a little terrified. I thought, the idea of vulnerability has come under critique in many talks, but I already had this ready, so I can't change it now. It's too late. You can critique vulnerability all you want, but there it is. What can I do? That happens at conferences, right? Whereas a critical posthumanism seeks to topple the human as a conceptual apparatus that underwrites ordinary practices of exploitation, the concept of the Anthropocene demonstrates that the Homo sapiens has achieved an astonishing feat, that of epoch-making planetary alteration, if not domination. The hand-wringing confessions of human culpability seem coated with a shiny veneer of species pride. To think of the human species as having had a colossal impact, an impact that will have been unthinkably vast in duration, on something we externalize as the planet, removes us from the scene. As the capitalist rapacity of some and the subsistence needs of the many result unintentionally in the vast obliteration of ecosystems and the extinction of species, modes of acting within systems and environments, such as the quotidian repetitions of eating and eliminating, seem worlds apart from the aesthetically rendered scenes that deliver a spectacular view of the Anthropocene. Indeed, the epistemological position of the Guide's Eye view that Donna Haraway critiqued in her early essay, Situated Knowledges, surfaces within some of the theoretical, scientific, and artistic accounts of the Anthropocene. Ironically, at the very moment that the catastrophes of the Anthropocene should make it clear that what used to be known as nature is never somewhere else, even the bottom of the sea has been altered by human practices. The quote, and these are all quotes from Haraway, the conquering gaze from nowhere, the view of infinite vision, the God trick of an unmarked, disembodied perspective are all reasserting themselves. As we are hailed into a species identity that is one solid mass, admitting no particularities of gender, race, class, sexuality, or even culture, region, or historical time, innumerable actions, systems, and lives become solidified in this formulation. Take, by contrast, the narrative of evolution, which also plays out on a grand scale, but which stresses a multitude of happenings that the human is always already not only within, but generated from. Whereas Darwin's Descent of Man encourages the reader to recognize the history of evolutionary ancestors in their very own form, as impossible expanses of time yield the bodies of the present, the anthro of the Anthropocene evacuates us of our corporeal specificities, freeing us for speculative temporal leaps and abstract calculations of causality, responsibility, and potential doom. Furthermore, the emphasis on the geological dimensions of the Anthropocene may calcify the assumption that a stable, separate physical world exists outside the human, and that the human subject is an immaterial generator of scientific knowledge, knowledge that petrifies the human species into an epochal, massive, yet disembodied force. Our flesh, our evolutionary kinship with other creatures, our multi-species microbiomes, our permeability vanishes. Material feminisms, feminist epistemology, feminist science studies, posthumanisms, and new materialism may all be productively brought to bear on Anthropocene discourses, along with the environmental justice activism of citizen scientists and the feminist, queer, and environmental protests that perform corporeal vulnerability as an ethics and a politics. One of the most mainstream versions of that, and an icon of the climate crisis protest. The concept of the Anthropocene, with its geological origins and its undifferentiated anthro, conjures up a world of man and rock, an oddly stark rendition when one considers that the current biophysical realities can only be approached through the scientific captures of a multitude of intersecting biological and chemical as well as geological transformations. Ironically, even as the Anthropocene proclamations deny human nature dualisms, the focus on geology rather than, say, chemistry or biology may be employed to segregate the human from the ominous anthropogenic alterations of the planet. And I'm speaking here not of actual geologists and interesting people like we have here talking, but in this sort of mainstream versions of how this gets out there in the world, and even some of the mainstream theories of it. So, Deepak Chakrabarty's first thesis in The Climate of History is anthropogenic explanations of climate change spell the collapse of age-old humanist distinctions between natural history and human history, as you all know. And yet, Chakrabarty brackets humans as biological creatures, stressing the enormity of our collective geological alterations. He writes, quote, "Human beings are biological agents, both collectively and as individuals. They have always been so. There was no point in human history when the human were not biological agents. But we can become geological agents only historically and collectively. That is when we have reached numbers and invented technologies that are on a scale large enough to have an impact on the planet." While we could read the phrase biological agents as meaning that humans are biological and act on biological, the phrase geological agents, which follows, delimits the first phrase to imply that humans have had an effect on biological entities, not that we are ourselves interwoven into living and non-living transcorporeal networks. Moreover, the distinction between biological and geological agency is, to me, and I'm not a scientist on this, but still, not tenable as the phrase the planet itself, which suggests that we've managed to alter this, the third rock from the sun, is deceptive, since biological and chemical transformations flow through this world in multiple and messy ways. And of course, the origin of so many of these alterations, the colossal output of carbon, is primarily a matter of chemistry. Indeed, the essay, The New World of the Anthropocene, published in Environmental Science and Technology, states, quote, far more profound than the, quote, plainly visible effects on the landscape are the chemical and biological effects of global human activity, including the rise of CO2 levels, the sea level rise, the acidification of the oceans, and the sixth great extinction. Privileging the hard, the visible, the lithic, imports delusions of separation, strength, and control that have no place in the global biological, chemical, and geophysical interactions of the Anthropocene. Chakrabarty asserts, quote, for it is no longer a question simply of man having an interactive relation with nature. This humans have always had, or at least that is how man has been imaged in large part of what is generally called the Western tradition. Now it is being claimed that humans are a force of nature in the geological sense. And even though he's distancing himself from it in the tone, I still think that this is what he's putting out there. So while the idea that humans have become a force of nature in the geological sense may be key to the whole concept of the Anthropocene, and while it may seem to merge humans with something called nature, whatever that is, the rather abstract formulation of the force positions him as a rather disembodied potency outside the nature he would alter. Transcendent fantasies offer a refuge from the radical risk, uncertainty, and here it is, I'm sorry, vulnerability of the flesh. Not to mention the fact that you know, this becomes this weirdly sort of personalized drama, right? Man and nature, and not capitalist systems. I mean, systems of capitalism, technology, all of that are just erased from this drama. It's a very sort of crude little portrayal that arises from some of these accounts. So I offer my conception of transcorporeality as a counterpoint here. In Bodily Nature, Science, Environment, and the Material Self, I analyze the environmental health and environmental justice movements, including the citizen scientists who must discern, track, and negotiate the unruly substances that move across bodies and places. Nature, in quotes, is not something external nor eternal, but instead the immediately present, ever-changing materiality of the world and of ourselves. Thinking materiality as agential, thinking bodies as continually transforming, and thinking across bodies and places in ways that highlight their interactions culminates in what I'm calling transcorporeality. It entails a radical rethinking of the physical environment and human bodily existence by tending to the transfers across those categories. It begins with the subject in place, where the materiality of xenobiotic substances, consumer products, invisible flows and networks cut through the ostensible outline of the self, transforming the human subject into a post-human subject who's always already the very stuff of the world. As a type of material feminism, transcorporeality is indebted to Judith Butler's conception of the subject as immersed within a matrix of discursive systems. But it transforms that model, insisting that the subject cannot be separated from networks of interactive material agencies, drawn on Karen Burrott, of course, and thus cannot ignore the disturbing epistemological quandaries of risk society. John Munn will work back there. Thinking the subject as a material being, not as a transcendent, utterly rational subject, but as a being subject to the agencies of the compromised, entangled world, enacts an environmental posthumanism, insisting that what we are as bodies and as minds, and you can't really separate those, of course, is inextricably interlinked with the circulating substances, materialities, and forces of the wider world. So I guess I'd like to claim that transcorporeality could also be seen as a mode of Anthropocene feminism, in that neither the physical world nor the human is natural, pure, static, or delineated in advance. It fits a lot of those categories, I think. So in that book, one of the things I discuss is Rhonda Swillinger, who herself actually has multiple chemical sensitivity, and she has a book of photographs about living with multiple chemical sensitivity. And in her photos, the human is coextensive with the environment. This is one of my favorite ones. So she basically is a photo of someone who had to move out of her house because the house was too toxic. So then she put all of her stuff kind of outside and under a carport, so it's sort of in and sort of out. And you can also, in the original photo, see some of the background as well. So it's interesting. So the human is coextensive with the built landscape of consumerism, where everyday objects, the domestic and the environment, become scrambled and menacing. Welcome to an imploded Anthropocene in the domestic sphere, where we dwell already within these anthropogenic forms. The predominant visual depictions, that's another one of hers. The predominant visual depictions of the Anthropocene, however, remove the human as a creature, offer reassuringly distant perspectives on the spectacle of the planet. The blog, the Anthropocene Journal, I don't know if you can read underneath there, the subtitle is called People, period, Rock, period. People, rock. The geology of humanity. Okay. And the Anthropocene Institute website features the art of David Thomas Smith, introducing it with an epigraph by A. Revkin, which says, "We are entering an age that might someday be referred to as, say, the Anthropocene. After all, it is a geological age of our own making." I don't know if you can see that. Can you see it? Okay. Maybe I'll read this. So for the artwork, it says, "Composited from thousands of digital files drawn from aerial views taken from internet satellite images, this work reflects upon the complex structures that make up the centers of global capitalism, transforming the aerial landscapes of sites associated with industries such as oil, precious metals, consumer culture, information, and excess. Thousands of seemingly insignificant coded pieces of information are sewn together like knots in a rug to reveal a grander spectacle." So here's one, here's one. They're actually long like that, but it's harder to see. So these constructions are grand spectacles indeed. The swirling Baroque designs are entrancing. They urge viewers to shift scales and recognize how small alterations in the landscape may be multiplied into geographical immensity. This immensity, however, is safely viewed from a rather transcendent and incorporeal perspective, not from a creaturely immersion in the world. Moreover, although trees are visible, for the most part these landscapes are devoid of life. They depict hard, flat surfaces like planetary puzzle pieces. The aesthetic is one of order and symmetry within complexity, suggesting the possibility of and desire for exquisite, intricate manipulations. Despite the scaling up, these are, to contradict Nina Lloyd, tame things, despite their immensity. The world is rendered into a kaleidoscopic vision you may hold in your mind like a toy in your hand. There's so many of these, and I'm going to run out of time if I show you more. There's some more art. This is subway systems. This is for Diane Chisholm. This is by the steps of Mongolia. So these images here, and I'm not going to have enough time to go to the site and look at them all, but you can go there if you want. They're actually really beautiful. These are all sorts of geological images, a kind of Anthropocene corn here. So beautiful. So I'm not objecting to the stunning images as such, but to the way in which they are or may become the icons of the Anthropocene, part of a visual apparatus in which an aesthetic response is a dead end. And that's what I'm interested in sort of theoretically in terms of ethics and politics. It's an aesthetic response that's a dead end. The photos ask nothing from us. They make no claim. They don't entangle us. They don't implore us. That's it. So Time magazine has this other featured video called Welcome to the Anthropocene. And it's just a video which is a lot of zooming out and moving around and zooming out, you know, just as you could imagine yourself. So I do understand that understanding the Anthropocene is a matter of trying to deal with this imaginative challenge posed by vast scales of time and space. But zooming out solely removes humans and all other living creatures from view, transforming the world from liveliness to a pattern. Man, an abstract geological force, surveys the world he has wrought while other species vanish from view. So one of the challenges of the Anthropocene in terms of a cultural imaginary is to counter the commonsensical view that rocks signify something solid, external, and eternal. And I was very grateful last night to hear from Jill Schneiderman about minerals evolving, the idea that minerals evolve. I thought that was really fascinating. And there are other scholars who are working on this, say Jeffrey Cohen's new book, Stories of Stones, An Ecology of the Inhuman, is coming out soon. He says, this book is something of a thought experiment, attempting to discern in the most mundane of substances a liveliness. Despite relegation to a trope for the cold, the indifferent, and the inert, stone discloses a queer vivacity, a perilous tender of mineral amity. And he posits a human lithic enmeshment, which is quite a bold idea, I think. There's also this book, The Making of the Geologic Now, which incorporates all sorts of restructurings, scaling up, scaling down, but also this idea of inhabiting the geologic, all of these art projects and things that are trying to inhabit the geologic, probably lots of them. Okay, moving to Rochelle and acid. So rather than thinking of the human subject as a now geologic force, an unmarked man who's left his mark on the planet, I'd like to cultivate post-human recognitions of differential vulnerability that arise from the recognition of our own immersion in interactive substances. This is a call to contemplate your shell on acid as a liquid dissolution of the outline of the human plunges us into an Anthropocene environs that can never be external. It's a call for scale shifting and traversing that's intrepidly, even psychedelically empathetic, rather than safely ensconced. While the human alterations in the geophysical land masses of the planet have become a grand spectacle, another anthropogenic transformation, the acidification of the oceans, is invisible. Competing against spectacular storms, gigantic gyres of garbage, and the bloody slaughter of whales, something as benign sounding as an alkaline shift is unlikely to capture the public's attention. This is an essay about, or a scientific piece of marine life on acid, and explains how it works. She also introduces it saying, even though ocean acidification was only coined as a term in 2003, it's already become known as climate change's evil twin. And she explains that the ocean is a massive carbon sink, estimated to absorb 1/3 of all the CO2 produced by human activities, and basically, this has resulted in increasing acidification of the oceans that threatens all sorts of creatures in different ways. So research on how the shift in alkalinity affects sea life and ecosystems is only just beginning, but already a strange array of effects have been captured. The acidification makes the eggs of the red sea urchin not as quick as they need to be in blocking out a second sperm, resulting in inviable embryos. I guess this is really important to them in their reproduction. They can't have more than one sperm in there. The tiny plankton, Ostreococcus forae, which is normally 1 micrometer, enlarges to 1.5 micrometers with increased CO2, which actually is a huge difference means that all of these creatures that eat it can't eat it anymore. And so all of these food webs are falling apart because of that small shift. The alteration of ocean alkalinity even causes confusion and destructive behavior in some fishes, which is fascinating in its scrambling of biosemiotics with chemistry. Even more dramatically, the increasingly acidic seas are literally dissolving the shells of sea animals. Aesthetically striking images of dissolving shells enlist concern for ocean acidification. Isn't that beautiful? Actually, it looks a little dark up there. The original's not so dark. I don't think I can do anything with that, though. These images do not usually include the actual fleshy creature who inhabits the shell. This sort of reminds me of how the car commercials used to be. You never used to see a car commercial with a driver because you're supposed to think of yourself in the big car, the big truck, being all dominant and having all that fun in their car. They invite us to take up residence ourselves here within these precarious abodes. And they do show that it's really tough. This is the same shell. That's how it's dissolving. There you go. The shape of the shells, the spirals that swirl with continual smooth transformation between what is inside and what is outside, suggest the contemplation of our own bodies as intertwined with our surroundings. An image, of course, not unlike Elizabeth Grosch's image of the body as a Mobius strip of volatile bodies. That pretty pictures the pteropods, I believe. So, let's skip that for time. Let me see how much more. The photos and videos of dissolving shells may perform cultural work, portraying the shift in alkalinity as a graspable threat to living creatures. Whereas the predominant sense of the Anthropocene subject en masse is that of a safely abstracted force, the call to contemplate your shell on acid cultivates a fleshy, posthumanist vulnerability that denies the possibility of any living creature existing in a state of separation from their environments. The small creature, which is already seemingly fragile, shell dissolving, provokes an intimacy, a desire to protect, even as it floats within the nearly unthinkably vast expanse of the seas. The scene of the dissolve demands an engaged, even fearsome activity of scale shifting from the tiny creature to its dispersal across the vast, vast seas. While the acidification of the ocean, in terms of its scale and its potential cataclysmic effects, demands exclusive consideration, the waters of the seas are riddled with radioactive waste, toxic chemicals, and plastics, all of which become part of the sea creatures that, not unlike Beck's citizen in risk society, lack the means to discern danger. Contemplating your shell on acid is a mode of posthumanist transcorporeality that installs all creatures of the Anthropocene, that insists all creatures of the Anthropocene dwell at the crossroads of body and place, where nothing is natural or safe or contained. To ignore the invisible threats of acidity or toxins or radioactivity is to imagine we're less permeable than we are and to take refuge in an epistemological and ontological zone that is somehow outside the time and space of the Anthropocene. So the evidence of the potential cultural work here can be found, perhaps, maybe, in the fact that teachers are doing these experiments that the government actually has encouraged them to do. And then we get the climate change deniers saying we are more worried about the intellectual climate. And it says that NOAA urges teachers to terrorize kids on climate change, dissolve a shell in acid to simulate ocean acidification. You know you're on the right track somewhere, right? When they're talking about the terrorization of children. That's got to be a good thing if they're terrorizing children. So there are videos out here that look like this, showing you the shell. rather hypnotic, entrancing video, at least to me, probably says a lot about my German past, which is devoid of explanation, invites a kind of mind-altering contemplation. Calling us to contemplate our shell on acid suggests a sort of psychedelic experience, of course. And the spiral shells, especially when they are spinning around in the video version, suggest the spiral as the icon of altered states. This mode of engagement, this type of attention, often involves a disillusion between the human and the outside world, as Wikipedia tells us. Gotta go to Wikipedia. Some psychological effects may include, this is LSD, the effects of LSD. I gotta play with the acid reference in the conclusion here. How can I avoid that? So yes, what do we have? Well, you know all these things. A sense that one's thoughts are spiraling into themselves, loss of the sense of identity or the ego, and other powerful psychophysical reactions. Many users experience a dissolution between themselves and the outside world. There you go. So I wrote up this topic a long time ago, and then I got really lucky because someone named Richard Doyle came up with this book called Darwin's Pharmacy. And in Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere, he defines a term called ecodelic insight. In quote unquote, well, quote, the sudden and absolute conviction that the psychonaut is involved in a densely interconnected ecosystem for which contemporary tactics of human identity are insufficient. And another quote from him, and in awe we forget ourselves. He's talking about people taking acid and other, actually more natural substances, you know, mushrooms and et cetera, for the most part. And in awe we forget ourselves, becoming aware of our context at much larger and qualitatively distinct scales of space and time. And over again, we can read an ecodelic testimony that these encounters with immanence render the ego into a non sequitur, the self becoming tangibly a gift manifested by a much larger dissipative structure, the planet, the galaxy, the cosmos. And of course I would have to add the seas, the ocean there. So I'm going to stay in my time slot here and not go over time because it's the last session of the day and I know people are really tired. So I just have a little bit of a conclusion for you and then we can have a discussion and you won't feel like I made you start. So contemplating your shell on acid dissolves individualist consumerist subjectivity in which the world consists primarily of externalized entities, objects for human consumption. Contemplating your shell on acid means dwelling in the dissolve, a site of pleasure and danger in the feminist sex tradition, a paradoxical ecodelic expansion and dissolution of the human, an aesthetic incitement to extend and connect with vulnerable creatures of life and with the inhuman, unfathomable expanses of the seas. It's to occupy vulnerability, to expose oneself as a political act, to engage in a particularly feminist mode of ethical engagement. And I have one last slide I'm going to show you this morning. So this is a woman named Kirsten Justison, and she does a lot of performance art. I believe she's Danish. I know she's Scandinavian, but I think pretty sure she's Danish. It's interesting because, you know, now that climate change is the recognition of that is everywhere is a huge problem. These performances take on a new meaning. They're all about melting ice, right? She has a whole series of things, melting ice sculptures and putting herself on these ice pedestals. It's kind of hard to see it up here, but she's on a pedestal. It's on a pedestal that she's on. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about vulnerability because it's vulnerability as a form of insurgence. It's a performed vulnerability. She's naked. Obviously, the position invites penetration from behind, so there's that. But the black gloves, the black boots, there's a kind of insurgence to it as well. And so with this idea of the ice dissolving and putting her body there, I mean, there you go. That's the conclusion.
Well, thank you. That was so interesting, and I just can't help myself. But I want to, in terms of saying that this business of hurt on ice and transcorporeality, I often think of, I mean, we don't have exoskeletons, we have endoskeletons, and our endoskeletons are our bones, which are made up of calcium phosphate, the mineral apatite. And that oxygen, I often think to myself, what was I before once? Was I seawater, or was I glacial ice? Because the truth of the matter is, I mean, the idea of the dispossessed and multiple chemical sensitivities, I mean, we're all very aware of the fact that, we're permeable and we take into our bodies, multiple heavy metals, various things in the environment, but there's also a sort of beautiful transcorporeality that I tend to connect with, which is the idea that, I mean, the Earth is a closed system, and so, the oxygen that's now in my bones might one day be incorporated into a shell that will be dissolved by an acidic ocean, and end up in seawater and get evaporated and become part of a glacier. So I would love it if we could connect with that transcorporeality, in a less of a dystopic way.
Yeah.
And thanks for the shout out about mineral evolution. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow in my panel.
All right. Yeah.
But that was beautiful, and I just, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, can I just say that a lot, I'm writing a book on ocean creatures, so that's what I've been working on. And a lot of the scientists who are also activists, starting with Rachel Person, but then Julie Wiggy and more of the recent ones, actually do all invoke those narratives of the human body as connected to the ocean. My problem with that is that those usually, the kind of interactions and evolutionary shifts and all those things that are happening are often frozen at the point of where we are now. So they're often posed as we are the culmination of all of these things, and isn't it great that we have these ocean ancestors? But I think, yeah, but at this moment, we are doing all of these things that are destroying the creatures in the ocean. So it often gets invoked in a kind of romantic way that doesn't have any kind of political import. And so as much as I like that idea, I think that the way that it's usually put out there, it seems not so effective.
If I could just follow up then to say that actually it's not, that it didn't come out the way I mean it, which is, that oxygen has many different isotopes, and so we can actually trace in our bodies, the relationship, the isotopic ratio of O16 and O18 in our bones actually maintains that trace of, where it was before, was it in the ice or was it in the seawater, based on that isotopic ratio. And then if you add into, since 1945, the atomic catastrophes, then you have, isotopes of hydrogen that are going to show up in the watery parts of our body. So,
okay, I totally love that. I really love that. And I wish we had some setup we could all go into the
see what our O18, O16 ratio is. Right, exactly.
We'd all have these body, that would be great. I love that. I need to hang out with scientists.
I want to go back to how you started the talk, which was to say that it's a conference on Anthropocene feminism, and that part of your worry about, say, Tesh's essay is that the Anthropocene becomes this rather homogeneous chunk that's separated out, etc. So I was thinking throughout of a very not surprising book, which was, Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, which was written prior to the Anthropocene. Well, the emergence of discourse in the Anthropocene. And in some ways, it's deeply marked by a feminist point of view about consequences of what we might now call anthropogenic, toxic. But what always really interested me about the handmaid of the scale, and then became more interesting as this, was that the differences it was producing. What did we say before? Look at drove a pit through gender difference itself, because internal to woman were now these new kinds of bodies that then became the occasion for a new kind of social work. And in your talk, and again, it's like, well, okay, so there's environmental sensitivity, there's the big discussion, although we've proven it's not true, that autism is environmental, there's cancer, there are all sorts of things that are producing, that one might say they're creating important differences between, I'm just talking about the body, between the even human bodies that perhaps are still expressed in some older categories, gender, but perhaps also are demanding us to pay attention to things that feminism wasn't, well, partly was and partly wasn't. That is, there's Atwood who was, but it got absorbed back into the gender difference. And what if we paid more, rather than, I'm not saying get rid of it, of sexuality, but like those who, the environmentally challenged and those who are producing maybe exoskeletons, we don't know. We mainly are seeing it in a neurological way. So how do we as feminists or we as queer theorists allow these other transcorporeal effects that are producing differences but not in the categories that we built our models on to disturb us?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I write about that a little bit in Biology Natures, actually, with the chapter that talks about body burden testing, and I draw on Sarah Shostak's great work in that chapter. And one of the things that is happening with some of the body burden testing is that they're coming up with categories that are at risk that don't correspond to the usual environmental justice categories. So in the U.S., it may be totally different in other places, but in the U.S., the number one risk is in terms of environmental racism is being African American.
Yeah.
Well, I already said environmental racism. I should have said something else. But it's that is first. I mean, and then class, of course, correlates with that in various ways. But some of these organizations that do this kind of testing have come up with other categories that don't fit any of these models, like rural people. Like if you're near a farm, whether you're the owner of the farm or the person picking the stuff, if you're in an agricultural area, you are at high risk for all sorts of contaminants. And so, or children. Children are another group that's at high. And how do you conceptualize that? Because of course they cut across all sorts of areas. So I think that's one of the things that I argue is that that this sort of testing is going to yield all kinds of different sorts of risk groups and vulnerabilities that don't fit in, gender, race, class as we're used to seeing it, because one of the things I'm really interested in with science studies is these models of how do you have these captures of reality, and what is the interaction between the social and political formations, and then like what's going on materially, what is captured, why, what are the politics and the economics of that, and then how do activists and individuals, I'm interested in that, how do they access this, make sense of it, and do something. So yeah, that kind of scrambling is something that I've been really interested in. But as far as feminism with the groups, that's a different question, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, yeah, like what are the sorts of boundaries or parameters or ways of including things that we haven't thought to include?
I would think the discourse around acidification changes depending on the organism that it uses as its sort of poster child. So, for example, corals compared to sea snails compared to crustaceans. Have you noticed any particular shifts?
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, and I think probably there are going to be some entities that do better with acidification, right? Just like with climate change, there's going to be some that
Squid love acid.
Jellyfish.
Jellyfish love really super polluted water. So a lot of the scientific essays about jellyfish are that we're going back to the future of an age where the whole ocean will just be jellyfish. So, but you know, I think that the visual impact of a shell dissolving is just it has this kind of impact where if you had to say, well, this hurts these other creatures in various ways, it just doesn't have that kind of it's not a figuration, right? It's not something you can kind of almost grasp and so yeah.
Yeah, or even just thinking about like an evacuated crab shell compared to like a snail shell. I mean, the snail you can pluck out, but the living creature inside the crustacean.
Well, that's one of the things that I'm working on in my book is notions of the aesthetic. I've been working with Rancière and Latour in various ways and other people. And I mean, I am convinced that the way that these deep sea ocean creatures especially can be sort of connected with is primarily aesthetic. And so the question of the aesthetic has become really important to me because of the fact that those creatures, there's nothing else, right? So the talk where the person wasn't there after the erotic nature presentation, she actually wasn't there and someone read her paper for her. That, you know, the idea that the tangible, right, like this has been a big thing in animal studies, companion species, the tangible things that you can touch, things you can interact with, well, none of that works with deep sea creatures, right? And so, I mean, in response to the shell versus the crab shell is not as pretty, right? For the most part, I mean, most people probably, the spiral of this sort of shell already is culturally loaded with it as a shell, as an aesthetic object. It already comes to us from like collections of shells as being aesthetic. So partly is the way in which the aesthetic circulates with sea creatures. I think that's part of what's going on here, and it's sort of undeniable. Oh, there's a lot of hands. I don't know where to go next. Should someone else? Okay.
I just want to follow up right on.
Okay.
Because the comment you made very early in the talk about the problem with the aesthetic is really interesting to be really alternative.
Yeah.
And thinking about what the spiraling shell crosses, it's not just those collections of seashells that walks along the beach, which is a very relatable, behavioral, experiential, affective signifier. But those images actually are also quite technological.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering the relationship between sort of big data visualizations, which you can do very heavily at the beginning, the middle big data,
Yeah.
just this shell,
Yeah.
not sequence and
Right.
other kinds of sort of crossover between the cultural and the natural. And then endurance, bodies, the erotic, the visual, and this is our sort of privileged aesthetic as a sort of poster child.
Yeah.
So I would love if you could talk a little bit more about what that problem in the aesthetic is.
That's such a great question. And I knew that there would be a couple of media people here, and there would be good questions about that. I don't really know yet, except to say that something like the census of marine life put an awful lot of time and money into making their images spectacular and beautiful. But the scale is a sort of one-to-one relationship with a creature, right? I mean, so they're definitely incredibly technologically mediated. Any kind of image that you're going to get of something from the bottom of the sea is going to be extraordinarily mediated with technology. But then it's I don't know that I can do too much with that yet, except to just keep it in mind. I mean, there's a kind of paradox because it's giving you that kind of immediacy. A lot of the photos give you the sense of immediacy and a sense of connection
ocean. In fact, Claire Nubian's really, really beautiful book about sea creatures takes the scientists' photos and sort of, rearranges them. But she puts them in a way that they look like portraits, even of creatures that don't have faces, right? So there's clearly this effort to have this kind of ethical sense of recognition of something with a face, even though it doesn't have a face. And, that may be problematic. It's certainly highly technologically, coded out. It doesn't just happen. So, yeah. So that's a really bad answer to your question, which is much more interesting to the answer.
Let me ask a very specific question about, I think a very contemporary representational crisis that I call zoomability. And this is actually...
That you call what?
Zoomability.
Zoomability.
It's actually, I have a conference that a graduate student of mine is organizing, being paid for by Prezi. So anyone who's, it's got a lot of Prezi presentations here. But this
So
idea...
you show up and you do a PowerPoint, you're just, the instructor seat comes and you fly.
Now, this idea of how you can zoom from, these large images and into to even conceptualize ocean acidification is a zoom out that and then a zoom in into this, and this mismatch between how we can zoom representationally visually and where we can act is this where is agency and where is our view is kind of this representational crisis that I think is really, we can't throw out the alluring, seductive, ocean porn, as we call it, right? Because it need not produce a spectatorship. It need not remove, the aestheticization of an issue. It could be scripted into a kind of a zoomable way where our political agency and physical actions can be woven together. So this kind of the representational aesthetic opportunity of zooming from these images in and out to where we can actually how it aggregates.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that with the film. So in Beth's film, the photographs of the mountaintop removal were at this perfect sort of scale where you could see the mountaintop removal, and yet you could also distinguish trees. You could have a sense of this as like on the edge that it was an actual place, and so that's the sense of agency about this horrific thing that has been done is provoked, I think, by the fact that the scale, you're still connected. It still pulls you into, you could be a person walking in those trees. It's not so far removed that it seems completely uninhabitable or someplace else. I thought those photographs did a really good job that way. I know other people saw the same. There's one camera back.
Thanks. That was a trippy presentation in like the best way possible. But I'm gonna ask a
That's what I'm going
serious
for.
question.
Thank you.
What happens when we come up from our trip? Or is that a better analogy? Come down, sorry. I was thinking about tripping.
Right.
The actual anxiety
Right, so you're lost.
of regaining our identity from this sort of...
Right. Well, isn't this the conversation we just had outside, Rebecca? The idea that we're talking about how, it was Rebecca's point actually, about how when you go down these paths of, well, this should provoke this kind of reaction, and then you sort of want this politics to happen, and then you were saying, you don't have a lot of faith that things actually occur in those ways, and I said, I know, I don't either, but yet, what else do you have? I mean, as a sort of desperate environmentalist, and then a cultural studies person, I'm always at that point of, but what else do we have? Like, okay, you can make all of these critiques, and you can make philosophical points that are much more exciting in some ways, and yet I want to keep within the realm of some kind of intervention and stay in that place where it may not work, and there may be other things, and I hope there are, but this is the thing I'm trying to get at this moment. So I don't, when you come out of the trip, I don't know. I'm hoping that it provokes
mean, I guess, you could easily say human life mattering, because the predictions for ocean acidification are really dire. Like really, this could be the thing that kills us all off, is ocean acidification, because of the ramifications of, it's really, really dire. But I don't like to appeal to that. I like to appeal to other species.
Yeah, I think that I like the piece that you just said about avoiding the tendency towards apocalypse as the sort of motivating factor, because I was trying to do work with anti-nuke stuff in California, and they were totally immobilized by the fact that the sort of like dystopic apocalyptic narrative that didn't happen meant that people sort of stopped caring about the issue, and so it's a problematic sort of hinge. But what I'd be curious to hear talk about some is J.G. Ballard in one of his short stories talks about armadillos, like a fictional future where armadillos have consumed plant matter that's absorbed lead, and then the armadillo deposits the lead in its shell as a way to protect itself from a ton of radiation that is coming down from a decayed ozone layer. And it's a really provocative idea. And I think that one of the conversations that I haven't heard as much here, which I think is important, and I'd like to hear people's thoughts on it, is the way that the Anthropocene provokes in some people an interest in, I guess the term is usually like adaptation or resilience and I think that the risk of sort of acquiescing to things are going to go bad, how do we make it go less bad, and sort of like not contesting the sort of like underpinning of the argument and sort of saying, no, things are going to just be terrible. How do we make it less terrible? How do we adapt to a changed context? And so there was, throughout your talk, there was a sort of an undercurrent, not really an undercurrent, it was very present for me, this sort of question of the relationship of the question of insurgent vulnerability in relationship to the discourse of adaptation or resilience, and how that sort of is.
That is such a big question.
Yeah.
Insurgent vulnerability in relationship to adaptation and resilience. I like that. I like the idea of those things being connected. I really like that. It seems to have a bit of hope without being delusional, right? I can't do much more with it except to really enjoy the fact that you put that idea in my mind. Yeah. Maybe other people can do something more with that than I can at the moment, but yeah.
Well, this possibility of involvement or dissolution, or on the other hand of it, inextricability and the many other terms that were coming up. And so then I thought that maybe in a way what you're doing is maybe societal and the gods. Right? Those were the figures of what do you call it? Intersectionality, of interdisciplinary, and intersectionality. Those were the big figures for a while, the Bible or the gods. And you're actually moving from either both of those. One is a bit of an exoskeleton, and the other one's attached to God, and these other formal worldviews, I guess. And now this dissolution or dissolving and should become meshed in this natural world, like real jellyfish maybe. And it's less, it seems less heroic than these other figures that have come up in that to try to, deal with power. This is a giving way, and it's going to be a hard step.
But I actually really honestly believe that it's sort of the theory of transcorporeality is that we are always already in, we don't have the solid boundaries. And I think that a lot of the delusions of capitalism and of all sorts of things that get into problems are all about imagining that we are bounded creatures. And I think that it's a mode of power that's also a delusionary mode. And so I actually think that it And to, I mean, even just to think about all the threats to your own health, if you just want to start with that, much easier not to think of them. Lynn had her hand up for a long time.
Really kind of all of these things. I still want to just ask about sort of the general frame that you're using to talk about feminism specifically. I guess I have a word, it's a worry about the vulnerability. And a worry about how there seems to be this binarism almost between a transcendent, mythic masculinity, right? It's this sort of God's eye view of the Anthropocene versus this liquid, feminine, dissolving, oceanic imminence.
Yeah.
It sounds like similar to Beauvoir, right? So, and I know that you're not working in those binaristic ways, but I guess I worry about then the possibility of that being attached to some sort of politics of the range-edness, a la Wendy Myron's critique. And so how do we have these encounters with feminists and dwell in the dissolve without falling into the dangers of that kind of attachment to our woundedness? And I'm thinking about that in contrast to what Myra Hurd said about the cleaving of violence. It's also part of that.
Yeah.
And the need to acknowledge the gifting of violence that is part of these stories.
Right. Yeah, and that same binary really bothered me as I was writing this paper. It really, really bothered me. But I was trying to think, and this isn't actually part of any book or anything. I mean, it really was something in response to the invitation to come here. So the argument is actually not part of anything else. But when I thought about what can feminist theory contribute to the idea of the Anthropocene, I looked at all of these dominant ideas of what the Anthropocene was, and I was really horrified. And I thought, well, there is this whole tradition of feminist science studies and feminist epistemology that critiques these very things. And I thought that was a useful critique. So in response to the idea that it's just a sort of woundedness or something, I mean, I don't really work with that at all. I mean, and the kind of ethics that I developed as far as transculturality or politics actually is all about both figuring out what the harms are that you have done. So you're just being your own self in your everyday life means that you are harming all sorts of creatures and peoples and everything else. And so the sort of science studies aspect of that has to do with what knowledges do you have about what, how harmful is this and to whom and where? I don't know, and why do I not know that? It's like Proctor's book about cancer, right? Like a brilliant book about what we do and don't know about cancer, and why it's money basically in economics that doesn't let us know these things. So it's about tracing both things. It's about yourself is coextensive with this consumerist world and environment, and so you're vulnerable because you're materially part of that, but also everything that you do under the sort of carbon footprint model, for example, is the easiest way to explain that. Every single thing that you do is pretty much part of this sort of differential of harming others. So it's not about like being wounded at all. I don't ever write about anything like that. It's about negotiating myriad things in the world in ways that you try to know them, but as you try to know these things, it's actually very much part of political movements. Like the information that you get depends upon politics, it depends upon science, it depends upon communities, right? So it sort of all goes outward in these sorts of ways that I think are political and not really individualized at all, because no one individual would have those knowledges. But I totally understand what you're saying, and I knew that putting this out there, especially after hearing all the critiques of the idea of vulnerability, was, I knew that was going to be a problem. But, and still, I think that the reason why I put it out there nonetheless is because I do forces that would have us disconnect and consume and just participate in capitalism as usual, and even see something like the Anthropocene or climate change, this huge crisis, as just something we watch going on that's way over there, in pretty images of it, or formulations of it that really pretty much take us off the hook personally. I want something else. And I want life in the ocean, I really do. I'm not indifferent to whether or not life exists in the ocean. I really do want life in the ocean. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm Noelle Sturgeon, I'm at European University in Toronto, and I say that because I traveled a long way to get here, and I wanted to thank the organizers of the conference. It's really important to show how much feminism has to offer in terms of stable mental analysis and thinking about solutions and so forth. So I really appreciated, Stacy, that you started to talk off by talking about the value of the kind of work that's been going on for many years. Various environmental feminists, whatever you want to call them. And the danger of having that legacy erased. I wanted to ask you a question, but I also just wanted to make a provocation to the audience that I think we should start calling it the Anthropocene instead of the Anthropocene, as a kind of shout out to those folks, those environmental feminists who intervened in the ecology debate by saying that you were talking about androcentrism, not anthropocentrism. And I think saying that the Anthropocene makes it clear that it's a feminist move, because feminism is not always, to me, not been about gender, but it's been about making the connections between different kinds of inequality and being able to talk about power. And so that would be able to enable us to talk about, patriarchal, colonial capitalism as the entities that are responsible for what's happening. So that sort of brings me to the kind of question that I wanted to ask, which is similar to this, the questions that just the two questions that have been asked about flexibility and dissolving. And that is how your answer to that I thought was really interesting and really good, but I'm still looking for something that enables us to tell the difference between an individual feeling responsible because they're thinking of themselves as a transcorporeal being and they're understanding how this is affecting them. And whether or not that doesn't trigger the kind of what Annie South calls the inverted quarantine effect, which is that if you feel vulnerable, what you do is you protect yourself and your family or maybe your community.
Right. Yeah,
And those people who have the resources to do that are going to create these little green enclaves.
Right. Yeah. That's a good
And,
critique.
and so I wonder how you think about that.
Well, I can't resist your first formulation, though, because I have to say that even though I've always been a feminist and I've always been an environmentalist, I oftentimes don't put the two together. And so the idea of the Anthropocene, to me, would be horrifying, because I think that there are as many women as consumers and as, the industrialized women destroying the environment as there are men. And so
That's why it's a provocation.
yeah, and it's one I would totally reject. Most of my work shows the problematics of combining feminism and environmentalism. I think it's really dangerous actually to combine feminism and environmentalism. It really depends on exactly what kind of feminism you're talking about, exactly what kind of environmentalism you're talking about, and in what exact context and in what exact historical period, because I think a sort of overarching connection is really dangerous. You get the naturalized women should be barefoot and pregnant, and there should be no birth control, and there should be no dildos, and there should be, because none of these things are like natural, right? And so I think that that's Margaret Atwood's surfacing. That's how surfacing ends, because she goes back to nature and is barefoot and pregnant, and or actually barefoot and then needing a man to get pregnant with. She gets her man, she gets pregnant. She's like, it's this whole like devolve that. So I think gender is really important. I think queer politics is really important. I think environmentalism is really important. But the ways that those things go together, I think, are really tricky. I think still, especially like with queer politics and environmentalism, that's even more difficult, right? Because environmentalism has the kind of norm of not reproduction of humans, but still, I mean, there's this idea that you want creatures to reproduce and things like that. And so well, lots of things there, Giovanna Chiro's excellent work on this and other things. So I think these things are problematic, and I think just sort of putting them together doesn't work. So I've always tried to carefully take them apart, even though I find myself listed as an feminist and I'm on the web. I'm really not. So often I'm a critic of it. So I had to respond to the first point, but
I think that what we're talking about here is the way in which you use precisely feminist theory, precisely asking to be more specific to historical. Be very careful about what you put in.
It depends on which feminist theory. Anyone else want to make a?
Yes, I'm very
Okay.
I think we're probably over time.
Yeah.
And so everybody's been very, you want to say something?
I was going to say one thing before we leave. Just to say a shout out to Marina Zerkow, who couldn't be here, but put the images on our template and poster, and perfect for your ocean studies because that film from which our images are derived, or is actually a film about kind of imagined world with jellyfish rule. So she couldn't make it, unfortunately, but she's represented digitally online, and there's a link to it on the contemplate. Thank you.
Great. And that's better than anything I was going to say. So why don't we just